Hello, everyone. My name is Melanie Richter-Montpetit, and I'm the director of the Center for Advanced International Theory, short CAIT, here at the University of Sussex. I would like to welcome you to today's lecture by Professor Sumi Madhok from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Madhok will present material from her brand new book titled Vernacular Rights Cultures, The Politics of Origins, Human Rights and Gendered Struggles for Justice. I would like to thank the Center for Cultures of Reproduction, Technologies and Health, and the Center for Rights and Anti-Colonial Justice for co-sponsoring the event. As always, my special thank you to Eve Wilcox, who does much of the work in getting us together this afternoon. A few words of housekeeping. The event will be recorded and published online, including on our center's YouTube channel. Professor Madhok will speak for around 45 minutes, and then we have a good 40 minutes for questions and conversation. I'm going to introduce today's speaker. Sumi Madhok is Professor of Political Theory and Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Quite unusually, she is a feminist political theorist with an ethnographic sensibility. Her work combines theoretical, conceptual, and philosophical investigations with detailed ethnographies of the lived experiences, processes of political subjectivation, and of subaltern political struggles for rights and justice. Sumi Madhok's scholarship goes beyond producing critiques of Eurocentrism and develops new concepts, theoretical frameworks, and methodologies which contribute to setting new direction for the social sciences focused on epistemic interventions from the global south. Professor Madhok is the author of Rethinking Agency, Gender, Developmentalism and Rights, which was published in 2013, and the co-editor of Gender, Agency and Coercion, also published in 2013, as well as the Sage Handbook of Feminist Theory, which was published in 2014. Now, her most recent book is titled Vernacular Rights Cultures, The Politics of Origins, Human Rights and Gendered Struggles for Justice, which was published with Cambridge just this year. Professor Madhok has been the recipient of numerous grants, prizes, and honors, including from the ESRC, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the British Academy, the Ford Foundation, and Leverhulme. Sumi Madhok has received several teaching awards. If ever you get lucky and a chance to visit her at her office, you will find the most thoughtful thank you notes and colorful self-made gifts from generations of LSE students, testaments to the excellence of her work also in the classroom. Sumi, over to you.
Wow, what can I say? Thanks so much, Melanie. Such a lovely and kind introduction. So I'm going to begin the talk, but I just kind of wanted, oh yes, I can see the share screen button, so I could start the share screen whenever I want to, yes, and that'd be all right. Okay. Thanks so much to everyone for coming. Yes, I'm super excited to be here, actually, and I'll tell you why. Because, for one, the book has been a very long time in the making, and I'm still caught up in a vortex of emotions, really, as I speak this afternoon. Vortex of emotions, including exhaustion, exhilaration, but also nervous anticipation about its travels and reception in the world. This afternoon actually also is the first time that I'm giving a book talk in the UK ever since the publication of the book, which was end of September, beginning of October. And so I'm super excited to be here in conversation with you. Many thanks to Melanie Richter-Montpetit for the generous invitation, and also to Eve Wilcox for all the arrangements this afternoon. Okay, so since it's a book talk, I think it's probably all right to begin at the very start of the book, is it not? I'm assuming that it's okay to do that. Okay, so let me then start right at the very beginning of the book, which is right here. And there we go, which is the book cover, actually. And And the cover of the book, if you look closely at it, has the word Hak written across it in 8 different languages. And those of you who read these languages would know, of course, without my saying, but at any rate, let me just point them out to you, which is classical Hebrew, Hindi, Manipuri, Persian, Swahili, Turkish, Urdu, and Arabic. And as I said, for those of you who read these languages would know, of course, that the word hak is the principal word for a right in all of these languages. And the word itself can be traced to classical Hebrew and has been known to appear in pre-Islamic poetry and then the Quran. It's also found in the older Semitic languages, such as Aramaic and Mendian, and also it exists across several indigenous languages, by which I mean languages of the indigenous peoples in the subcontinent. Over these centuries, the word has traveled across continents to become the principal word to signify a right in South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Hak or hak, spelled quite differently across, appears in Hindustani and Urdu lexicon in the region that I've been studying and tracking for over 2 decades now, through the influence of Persian in the Indian subcontinent, which of course was the official language before the British colonial state arrived, where it cuts across geographical, religious, and linguistic boundaries to become the principal word deployed to claim rights by subaltern groups in northwestern India and also in Pakistan. So what can the presence of the word hak in the vernacular and its use tell us about contemporary articulations, practices, and discourses of rights and human rights in most of the world? What can it tell us about the different contexts of rights, meanings of rights, and about the conceptual languages of rights in other parts of the globe? What does an attention to hak tell us about the forms of rights politics, subjectivities, and the processes of political subjectivation that these engender? And furthermore, what can it tell us about the other political cultures, imaginaries, contestations, and struggles for rights? How can scholarly investigations of contemporary struggles for hak inform global human rights scholarship? And how useful, in turn, is the global human rights framework for conceptually capturing rights politics in most of the world? By asking these questions, this book that we're talking about today produces a perspectival shift in the study of human rights, a shift in standpoint that is explicitly oriented towards the study of vernacular rights cultures. The vernacular political cultures of rights documented in the book are active sites of subaltern politics, struggles and contestations of rights and human rights. And although there's some literary production at these sites, this book predominantly tracks and documents the oral narratives of subaltern groups engaged in contemporary struggles for rights entitlements in order to provide an epistemic accounting of the political imaginaries, gendered subjectivities, and critical vocabularies of rights and political agency that inform these struggles. By all accounts, then, these vernacular rights cultures are non-elite, particular, unprivileged sites of rights articulation and politics. They are therefore not the universal, not the cosmopolitan and the global, but rather they signify and signal the unequal epistemic power relations between global human rights and the politics of vernacular rights cultures. And that is why the latter are the vernacular and the global. Vernacular rights cultures do not emerge, but are made through subaltern political struggles that are intersectional, gendered, and intensely conflictual. Okay, so how to tell then different stories of rights politics in most of the world? That's the burden of the book, really. And what I'm then going to do in rest of the time that I have is to do really 3 things in particular. One is I'm going to talk about the framework for thinking about this rights politics in most of the world, which I've called vernacular rights cultures. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the work that this framework does in displacing particular kinds of hegemonic rights stories, but also the framework through which human rights politics is spoken about, visualized, described, discussed, and so on. And in particular, I'm going to sort of say that it displaces what I call the politics of origins and its accompanying time-space provincialism. But crucially, it enables knowledge production on rights and human rights in most of the world. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to study these vernacular rights cultures, because that's another intervention that the book makes. So yes, you can do all of these things and ask all of these different questions, but how do you actually go about studying them? And here's the, I tell you straight away, I'm not going to kind of wait to give the game away right at the end. So here it is. It is through what I call a feminist historical ontology. And that is a very particular intervention that the book makes methodologically in order to study these. So the word Hak then provides me with my cue for studying vernacular rights cultures. As I was sort of saying earlier, for nearly 2 decades, I've been tracking the deployment of Hak through the deserts of Rajasthan in northwestern India, where different subaltern groups have been mobilizing to demand rights to food, information, gender and caste equality and employment from the state, and where Adivasi groups, the indigenous groups, are demanding rights to sacred and ancestral forests, streams, rivers, and lands. The word Hak, however, of course, does not recognize national borders and formations. If anything, it undermines them. And consequently, I've been ethnographically tracking the deployment of Hak through within subaltern mobilizations, not only in India, but also in Pakistan, from Rajasthan's eastern regions, which are mostly rocky, thorn scrub forested and sand-filled terrains, to the Aravalli Hills in the south, where the dry tropical forests burst into thick, lush undergrowth in the monsoons. I have traveled with the word as it further into northwest, into the subcontinent, and to the green plains of the Punjab and in Pakistan, where for the last 80 years, very poor peasants have waged a struggle for land rights and taken on the might of Pakistan's military to emerge as the most significant working class struggle in post-colonial Pakistan. And that's the name of the struggle, which is the Anjuman Mazareen, or the Tenants Association of Punjab. Now, these struggles, subaltern struggles for rights, tie rights firmly to gendered struggles for economic, political, epistemic, and ontological justice. They interrupt state-centric, but also well-rehearsed originary stories of temporalities, global institutional histories, and abstract subjectivities, which are, as you all know, the staple of global human rights discourse, to generate instead historically specific discourses of rights, replete with their own languages of claim-making, subjectification, and world-making. Now, I must say really at the outset here that the stories of vernacular rights cultures are no authentic or pure, hermetically sealed stories emerging from the global south. In fact, quite the converse. The coercive entanglements of histories of colonialism, together with the penetrative capacities of state developmentalism and transnational capital, have not only rendered talk of authenticity impossible, but have also at the same time laid bare the magnitude of epistemic and ontological violence unleashed on subaltern groups. Developmentalism and dispossession then constitute important sites of subaltern rights talk in South Asia. And these are also the grounds on which subaltern groups resist and challenge the irresistible power and authority of the state. These are then stories of critical conceptual vocabularies, subaltern mobilizations, and of conflictual gendered politics of rights. They're also stories of struggles for economic redistributive justice, but also for representational justice. These are stories of rights and human rights foreground, the conflictual, intersectional, and gendered nature of rights struggles. And they are also stories of opposition politics, of protest against authoritarian regimes. Crucially, and this is super important in the context of the book, is that the stories of vernacular rights cultures refuse what I call the politics of origins. Driving the scholarship on global human rights is an inordinate preoccupation with this politics of origins, which is actually a racialized and a binary global human rights discourse, which stipulates that human rights originate, belong, travel from, and operate for the West. Now, this politics of origins is shared by not only celebrators and detractors of human rights, but also by critical and progressive scholarship on human rights. And there is, as I say, an extraordinary alignment that goes across the field of both politics and scholarship. The politics origins puts in place particular forms of racial, epistemic, and political erasures. The story of politics of origins, of course, is first and foremost a racial story. As scholars have noticed, institutional histories of racism haunt historical, philosophical, and legal accounts of human rights. In more recent times, the politics of origins has contributed to eclipsing the role of anti-colonial movements against imperial powers, preferring to focus on the role of Western lawmakers and peacemakers, but also in epistemically silencing the scale and momentum of contemporary rights mobilizations and claim making across the globe. Significantly, the politics of origins does quite things which are very noticeable, actually, and we're very accustomed to seeing them in that kind of mode, which is that it organizes the global human rights discourse into a series of binary right stock and binary distinctions, the key ones being West, non-West, universalism versus cultural particularism, Asian values versus the Western political and civil human rights. Now, the binarism and several others. The binarism of right stock actually has led to a spectacular failure to pay attention to the forms of rights politics, the political cultures and modes of activism engaged in by subaltern groups in most of the world, not least by nation states who have deployed the binarisms of right stock to silence democratic aspirations to great effect. And the politics of origins, of course, is not, as I'm saying, without consequences in the hands of detractors, particularly authoritarian nation states. It places a politically expedient argument to delegitimize modes of protest and questioning of excessive state power on the basis that human rights are illegitimate, alien, and foreign, and therefore with little cultural traction and legitimacy. In critical progressive scholarship on human rights, on the other hand, this originary story shores up the West as the epistemic subject of human rights, although this time via critique. And how does it do that? Through displaying willful ignorance and historical amnesia around rights struggles in most of the world. You can be a fantastically critical scholar of human rights and not know anything, or not have to say anything about rights politics, rights claim making, mobilizations in most of the world. Now, I mean, I could go on here, but I want to really draw your attention to a specific effect of this politics of origins, which is the pervasive time-space provincialism of his. And this time-space provincialism also kind of, goes across disciplinary sites, historiographical, philosophical, and moral, that characterizes human rights scholarship. By time-space provincialism, I simply mean that the epistemic center of human rights intellectual thinking is temporally and geographically located in the West. So even if the timeline of originary stories might shift, and this is what we've been seeing in the last 10 years, so there is a kind of movement around the question of temporality is a big question, and so on and so forth, the location of human rights stories remains steadfastly in place, with the result that the geopolitical context of epistemic inquiry remains stationary. Now, the important work that this time-space provincialism does is that it invests epistemic authority in the global north, thereby leading to a lack of theoretical, philosophical, and conceptual attention to rights struggles in the global south. So they can appear as case studies in the local and so on, or vernacularized or in translation, but they certainly don't have any epistemic authority on their own. This widespread time-space provincialism in human rights shows up of course, in its predominant focus on post-World War II Anglo-European American stories of growth and spread of global governance, international law, international institutions, global histories of the politics of globalization, neoliberalism, global NGOs, and more recently of accounts explicitly focused on the pursuit of global justice and the growth of international humanitarianism. Now, these dominant stories of human rights that populate conservative and liberal accounts, but are also rehearsed actually by radical democratic theorists, have led to a widespread acceptance of what I call a depoliticization thesis. And this depoliticization thesis then again contributes to not only silencing and eclipsing accounts of ongoing mobilizations for rights in most of the world, but it has also resulted in the absence of at least two kinds of inquiries. First, It has meant that human rights mobilizations or rights mobilizations in most of the world have yet to centrally preoccupy scholarship on human rights within radical democratic theory and political philosophy, which continues to be predominantly focused on the Euro-American experience of the right to have rights, and the paradoxes and the aporias resulting from the founding of the originary moments of republicanism, and on the abstract theoretical and philosophical problems set off by the French and the American revolutions. And second, despite the growing awareness for a need for scholarly work on human rights and in different parts of the world, and I come across so much work in recent years, which makes this very sort of appeal for this, but then moves along. There exists a striking lack of scholarship that is explicitly aimed at not only tracking alternative genealogies of human rights, but also producing conceptual work that captures the stakes and struggles of rights and human rights, besides, of course, being able to critically engage, challenge, and speak back to the scholarly field of global human rights. For instance, it's certainly been the case, and that in recent years there have been powerful critiques of teleological and originary stories of human rights. However, these have not opened the door to an acknowledgement of other human rights stories and struggles, and importantly, to how these other stories might expand theoretical and conceptual and empirical thinking on the meanings and work that human rights do in most of the world. And so critiques, though, of course, are hugely useful and significant in demystifying the constellations of power and their entanglements and so on, but they must only be the starting point for the production of new intellectual and conceptual histories, geographies, and epistemologies of rights from different locations, including subaltern locations from across the globe. Crucially, theoretical and philosophical critique of global human rights alone cannot account for the life worlds of subaltern struggles for rights and entitlements, or indeed for the critical vocabulary and political grammar within which these struggles and demands are articulated. For quite simply, the terms of the critique of global human rights have been such that these have ended up resurrecting and reproducing the object of their critiques, i.e. the West, as I said, but this time via critique, while also simultaneously then reproducing the global inequalities and political economies of knowledge production. So, as you can see through this sort of accounting, it was clear to me that I could not seek to uncritically apply the global human rights framework, right, or the human rights framework, as that would be to activate a technical application, a serious charge of the technical application of theory, but also to invoke the serious charge of reproducing and authorizing the epistemic and geopolitical power of global human rights discourse. And so clearly I needed to find another way of entering the field of human rights without reproducing the huge epistemic power, or indeed the politics of origins, or indeed the time-space provincialism of global human rights, or compromising the complexity, dynamism, difference, and epistemic presence of human rights mobilizations in most of the world. So vernacular rights cultures and rights politics in most of the world. Vernacular rights cultures shift the epistemic inquiry of rights and human rights by curating, assembling, documenting different registers, imaginaries, and possibilities of and for rights encounters in the world. These alternative rights registers allow different subaltern politics of human rights to appear as an epistemic presence. And this is very important to the book, the appearance as to appear as an epistemic presence. Now, the epistemic presence of vernacular rights cultures then crucially disrupts two assumptions of global human rights discourse. One, universal and unidirectional translatability, and second, radical commensurability. The politics of origins insist on the unidirectional travel of global human rights from a specified location, but also that these become localized or vernacularized through translation into local contexts and into different local languages. However, vernacular rights cultures refuse this demand and also insistence on straightforward and simple and unidirectional translational global human rights practice to speak instead of different politics, meanings, epistemic authority, subjectivities, political cultures of rights, and human rights struggles. To summarize then, viewing rights politics in most of the world through the framework of vernacular rights cultures offers a lens through which complexity and dynamism of rights mobilizations might be analytically captured, not simply as those which are mimetic and engage in translation, enactment and localization of global human rights, but rather as those which have their specific languages of rights and entitlements grounded in specific political imaginaries, justificatory premises, and subjectivities. So one of the key things one of the key ways of making subaltern rights politics matter as an epistemic presence is through producing conceptual descriptions of rights and human rights in most of the world. And so one of the key epistemic interventions of vernacular rights cultures is to generate conceptual work from non-standard locations and contexts, that is, contexts outside those of which concepts are standardly produced, described, visualized, and so on. But why concepts and not build theories from the global south? Of course, that is how we are often sort of said, right? Theorizing from the global south, theory from the global south. And you might ask me that, but why focus on concepts and not on theorizing from the global south? Quite simply because concepts are the building blocks of theory, and they make our world visualizable and discussable. And therefore, the work of theory building requires concepts able to capture different encounters with the world at different locations. Furthermore, not only is there a need for concepts to describe and visualize different life worlds, but also for these different conceptual descriptions to intervene in and interrupt and disrupt the normal and ordinary work of theory production that carries on thoughtlessly and willfully ignorant of different life worlds and their conceptual architectures. To put it differently, the problem in producing theories for most of the world is that the concepts that are put to use in producing theoretical descriptions of the world are, to use debate Chakrabarty, provincial, and reflect particular temporal, spatial, social, and historical contexts. And therefore, an important way to interrupt the pervasive epistemic violence is not simply only to refuse to misrecognize provincialism for universalism and refuse to know the world only through unidirectional translation. It is also to insist on directing efforts towards producing a wider array of conceptual descriptions from most of the world. So, how to then do this work of insisting on epistemic presence and conceptual work in most of the world, and how to do this work on Hak. Right? Conceptual work on Hak, and how do we understand the conceptual meanings of Hak? So we need to ask particular kinds of questions. We need to ask what literal terms exist for entitlements and rights, what are their justificatory premises, what kinds of political and moral imaginaries they uphold, and who are the subjects that are assigned to rights and human rights within these political imaginaries. By political imaginaries, and in this case of political imaginaries of Hak, because that's what the book does, I refer to a set of dynamic gendered relations, ideas, practices, discourses, institutions, and subjectivities which attach to Hak, and in turn, those which it mediates, justifies, accords meaning to, and uphold. I'm also, as part of building this conceptual structure and architecture of Hak, what I've done in the book is also to track the justificatory premises of Hak that sustain these subaltern mobilizations. Now, the focus on justificatory premises is not to think of yet more justifications for human rights, but rather to give an account of the conceptual and normative structure of Hak and the rights and entitlements that it will allow itself to be assigned to. In short, I'm less concerned with the philosophical debates about what might be the ideal justificatory premises, that is, what might be the philosophical basis that rights and human rights ought to justified on or rest on, and more interested in documenting the actually existing justificatory premises of rights. Documenting the actually existing premises and the deployment of justificatory premises means to examine the nature of exclusions and the basis on which they are justified. It also involves examining the kinds of subjects that get assigned rights or those who are left out. And in my ethnographies, actually, I've been able to identify and document 4 different justificatory premises of rights and human rights. And in some of them overlap with the justificatory premises, particularly within liberal democratic theories, but they're also quite different from them. And the striking feature of these justifications is their dynamic nature, both in terms of subjects that they enable to come into being and the dynamic political imaginaries they produce. So here are the 4. And what I want to do is maybe go over a couple of them, give you a snapshot, right, of what I mean, what the people, what people in subaltern struggles that I've been tracking for over 2 decades, how they use these, how they use the word haq in order to justify their political activism, or and what basis they defend it. So the first one, political imagery of haq and haq as citizenship. And this is very ubiquitous. It was, I found it right across most of my tracking is the upholding of haq as citizenship. And here's what this is from a very, very long interview, and it's an excerpted form from that. And here it goes. And this is from participants engaged in the right to information movements, particularly by the group known as the MKSS in Rajasthan. And this is how they talk about it. As citizens, we have haq over this road. The road is built with our money. It is our money because we pay income tax. We pay also tax on whatever we buy, such as rice, dal, cooking oil. That is how the sarkar, the state, the government builds hospitals and schools. It builds these with our money. The money that people think is sarkari or belongs to the state, or the building that is seen to be belonging to the government or sarkari, we say to them, it is not sarkari, it is our building because it is our money. Our democracy must be safeguarded, for that will make our rights safe. Our effort should be that the Constitution continues to guarantee the rights of citizens. And actually, when pushed forward and pushed and pressed a bit further on, the argument kind of moves along and sort of says, well, if the government doesn't uphold the Constitution, then the government must be removed. So you've got that, which is very much linked to a certain kind of legal constitutionalism. And then you've got these justifications of haq, which are very strongly advocated by indigenous groups, in Southwest Rajasthan. And they say, earlier we used to take the produce openly from the jungles and without any restriction. And then suddenly we were told that there was a prohibition on the forest produce, as this was now a sanctuary for wild animals. We were told that we could not build our homes or rear our animals or sow the field inside the jungle. We were told that this was now protected land and a sanctuary, and that they were now going to develop a park, a national park inside it, and that tourists were going to come from abroad to visit the sanctuary. We continue to take the produce from the forests. We only take what we need. We are the owners of this jungle and the lands. We have a haq over these. Wherever there are Adivasis, indigenous groups, there are jungles. In the cities, there are none. We have protected the jungles. The haq over these forests and waters comes from our ancestors. These are our sacred lands. And our ancestral spirits reside here. We have ancestral rights over these lands. Our forefathers have used this land for centuries. We tell the state forest officials, you do your job and stay here, and that together we can stop the jungle mafia who go into the jungles, in their lorries illegally and for commercial purposes. But you cannot stop us from taking the produce from our own, for our own use from these jungles, or force us off our lands. You've got a justification of haq, which is now no longer state dependent, if you see what I mean. It has a separate sort of premise altogether, and this is and this particular one, which I want to kind of bring to notice, is premises haq on another normative idea, which is that of truth. And this comes out of actually a long struggle and encounter with the question of women's rights by very poor women, in mostly low-caste women involved in a state-sponsored program for women's development, which I've been following for 2 decades. I mean, these are very celebrated activists on the ground, and they became so they became celebrated that the state actually shut the program down because that exceeded the conception of what the state would agree as women's empowerment, or and so on and so forth. So it actually shut the program down. But these women were known as the satins, and the satins the word satin is a Hindi word which translates as a woman companion. And so that identity of a satin, and that radical identity that they carved out for themselves, they continue to speak of themselves as being a satin. So that's how they're talking about rights here. And they say, we satins exist so that we can assist the depressed and deprived women and become their voice. We speak the truth and walk the path of truth. The Sarpanch and the Patwari, which are officials responsible for village governance and for land records, are partners in corruption. Why should they speak the truth? They benefit by not walking the path of truth, whereas the Satin always speaks the truth. It's not party to their corrupt schemes. So here, this in their narratives, the truth, of course, is an expansive and non-cognitive term, and it's informed by ideas of rightness and justice. And you can see that kind of coming around because they are now finding a premise which is not state-derived, and that happens because of a series of conflicts and crises in their encounters with the state. But this is something else to note here, which is that this is not a human rights politics of minimalism and despair, right? Which is how also it appears within critical human rights scholarship, but one that is strongly committed to a politics of justice. And here truth occurs both as an ideal of justice in the form of a pack of principles, but also as an order of facts in the form of concrete practices. Because rights must do particular things. They must make available particular ways of being in the world. And that demands very particular practices associated with them. And so here, truth invokes moral rectitude, morally correct and fearless political agency, which is very much how they see as rights making available. And then one of the other justificatory premises that was very evident was Haqq as an Islamic ideal. Now, I say as an Islamic ideal because it's certainly the case that this is by talking about it as an Islamic ideal. I'm not referring to it as sort of as in terms of, I'm less interested in how close it is to sort of scholarly discussions on what constitutes Haqq as an Islamic ideal, but more in its take up and its use and its particular deployment, and in this case deployment against the state, which is quite interesting because it's deployed for secular ends. Now this word, and this is within the land rights struggle in Pakistan that I was talking about earlier. And these are activists within the Anjuman Mazareen in Pakistan, and this is how they were talking about what the word Haqq means and how they deploy it. So this word comes from Islam because Islam clearly marks out a very clear definition of the practices and conduct that constitute right behavior. Islam invokes Haqq in 2 separate ways as hukuk Allah, which is to do with right conduct in the discharge of religious obligations, such as offering prayers 5 times a day, fasting during Ramadan, fulfilling all those religious duties that make me a good Muslim, and Hukuk ul Abad, which relates to right conduct in respect of other human beings, including towards my government and my family. And this kind of moves on to talking about how Haqq relates to that question of land rights. The right to cultivate and possess ownership is prescribed in the Holy Quran. For instance, in the Quran, on paragraph 3, it says very clearly, if someone who cultivated the land for 5 years, he then becomes the owner of the land. Therefore, the Mazarin have a right over the land, which is justified by Islam itself. So you see the sort of using and invoking and deployment of a particular idea of haq, which is then related to idea of right conduct, but then used towards secular ends, and which I think is, really the interesting thing that I found happening quite a lot. So what is then going on in relation to the kinds of rights, justificatory premises, and the forms of rights politics and the rights thinking that they sort of lay out for us? First of all, and I'm just going to collect them here very quickly, because I imagine I probably have about 5 minutes or 6 minutes, maybe 7, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Whatever you need.
Whatever I need. Okay. All right. So first, that they are non-derivative from the state. And now this is quite interesting, because that umbilical link between state and rights, which you see in liberal democratic theory, is what you don't see here. Haq is non-derivative from the state. You see that in the indigenous groups claim making on rights. You see that in various other invocations, say, of Islam. You see that in the invocation of truth and so on. But the interesting thing is that even though they're non-derivative, rights require implementation by the state. And so here's that thing, that it's not, this is not sort of a rights in the form of a manifesto in quite that form, right? There's whereby there is no sort of duty bearer, no known duty bearer attached to it. There is actually a duty bearer that they see, and that is the state, even though rights do not come from the state. And therefore haq is dynamic and has justifications independent from the state. And what that means is that then it doesn't only posit symmetric and correlative relations between itself and the positive legal order of the state. It exists independent of law and has a moral authority of its own, right? And so therefore that question of what happens when the state takes away your haq, and then we need to change. We need to change the state, and the constitution takes away, we need to change the constitutions, because it is not coming from the state in most cases. And unlike moral individualism, which is sort of one of the mainstays of a lot of human rights thinking, in particular, analytic rights thinking, the dominant haq is not only the moral property of self-regarding individuals. In fact, it's quite a conflictual exercise because, of course, when gendered subjects demand rights and claim rights, what they are claiming, the reason why it's so conflictual is, of course, what they're claiming to is not simply rights, but also a very particular relation to the self. And that relation to the self then disturbs the gendered order, right? And so on, and that produces all of that conflict. But for now, I'm just going to simply say that it's not only the moral property of self-regarding individuals, and does not only engage in establishing dual correlatives between pairs of individuals, but signifies relational connections. And these relational connections then make it very difficult, or if you like, opens the way for subjects who are not normative subjects of rights to actually claim haq, or not, as the case might be, and also non-dichotomous relations between. So haq doesn't, in the sense, signifies a cosmic inseparability and indivisibility of individuals from the public good, and one sees that particularly in indigenous articulations of rights. The other thing that's quite noticeable is that neither humanism or moral sovereignty of the individual or their interests, whether collective or individual, underpin the justification of haq. So this is mostly in relation to the fact that, a lot of sort of philosophical thinking on rights, and I mean on rights in particular, is at the end of sort of a lot of, in the final instance, it tends to rest around persons, right, sentient beings and so on. And so, and around humans. So there's a humanism that runs through this rights thinking. And whereas in the articulations of haq, you find that they uphold a cosmological and a normative order that includes duties to protect nature, for instance. And it's not just, doesn't just stop at the borders of who, who constitutes a person and so on. And in that, and that moment exceeds humanism and is not confined or only consistent with humanism, but they're with humanisms. But of course, having said that, Hakka is not an horizontal concept, right? It is very much enmeshed in, gender relations, caste relations, class relations, and so on. And the conflict that comes about is precisely because of the forms of political subjectivation that it gives rise to. And when others, non-normative subjects, start demanding, claim making, and seizing their hak, and that's where the conflict ensues. So it's yes, there are all of these ideas, but it's very also important to remember that hak is not a horizontal concept. And so one has to be very, very careful around the questions of power relations that it upholds and that is itself embedded in. So one of the things that was quite, there's something I found right across the mobilizations I've been studying now for so long, and that is that in all of these political struggles that I have been looking at and tracking hak across, hak for women never once came up within organic political mobilizations. It always had to be begged separately. It always had, and you could see that with that the demand for, say, women's rights, for example, never came up within, say, the demand for right to food as such, or demand for land rights at all, and so on and so forth. And that whenever that question was brought up and begged separately, in addition to, then there would be, a little bit of a separate committee for, say, women to deal with that question, right? You always see that little sort of women's committee on this, that, the other. And so you always had that. And this is, and I'm not even going into the question of sexual rights here, right? So I'm just simply talking about, people who identify as women and who, who make claims for women's rights. Those rights claims always have to be begged separately, and that itself tells you something about the normative structure of hak. Okay, but what it does in some ways, and I think that's the possibility and potential it offers, is that it brings together the politics of rights with the politics of justice, so rights as justice. And this is something that that really interests me at this point of time, and I'm trying to think through as to how and the ways that happens. So this is the final slide in which talk about how to do this work of studying vernacular rights cultures, and the and I sort of say here, and I already told you right in the beginning, right? So that it's through the putting together of a very particular methodological toolkit, very particular methodological device that I've been able to do this work. And so focus on then vernacular rights cultures allows us to ask, a set of questions. How does, in this case, hak, but how does hak come into being as a principal word for a right in contemporary South Asia, in the region I'm looking at? What sorts of meanings it acquires? How does it make up people, aid the production of subjectivities? And in other words, and how does it, and the ways that it produces new possibilities for relating to the self? In other words, in what ways does hak enable but also constrain possibilities for being a gendered subject of rights? Now, I think that, to my mind, they seem a perfectly reasonable set of questions that the lens of vernacular rights cultures makes available. But they also raise an important question in that, how does one study these things? Or put it another stark way, what is methodologically involved in studying vernacular rights cultures? And so, as I said, I propose a feminist historical ontology as a methodological tool for doing this kind of work. But of course, you would have noted that by feminist historical ontology, I am drawing on, but also supplementing the insights of on historical ontology offered by the philosopher Ian Hacking. And I'm supplementing Ian Hacking's work on historical ontology with the insights offered by a critical feminist politics of location. Now, an important element of Hacking's historical ontology projects is a focus on words and concepts. Hacking is a wonderful interlocutor of Foucault, and historical ontology is a word that occurs in just, I think, once in Foucault's What is Enlightenment. And Hacking, like I said, he's a wonderful interlocutor. He picks it up and he proceeds with his own projects on historical ontology. And what draws me to Hacking is the focus on words and concepts, of how concepts come into being and acquire traction at particular historical points. And is Hacking's focus on words, concepts, their role in making up people, together with my long-standing interest in the gendered processes of political subjectivation and self-fashioning exercises, that draws me to his work on historical ontology. But Hacking's historical ontology, as I was saying earlier, requires supplementation. The supplementation becomes necessary because Hacking's historical ontology is neither informed by gendered power relations, and nor is he particularly interested in the existing nature of Eurocentered epistemic discourses. And in order for historical ontologies to reflect these two concerns, they will require supplementing with a critical reflexive politics of location that draws on post-colonial, decolonial, critical race, and intersectional feminist lens. So a historical ontology, a feminist historical ontology, then is the fusion of these two, of historical ontology with a critical reflexive politics of location. Accordingly, then, feminist historical ontologies produce an orientation towards generating conceptual accounts of encounters with the world that are responsive to a critical reflexive politics of location, to gendered power relations and struggles, to the coming into being of gendered subjects of rights. As a methodological device, feminist historical ontology locates itself firmly in the imbrication of epistemology and ontology, and it works to make explicit the ways in which concepts come into being, and in different locations, but also within particular knowledge systems. And it tracks the political imaginaries, justificatory premises, political cultures they enable, kinds of people they make up, politics in which they are invoked and sustained. And the work of feminist historical ontology then begins with an insistence that concepts are gendered, and that making up people is a gendered exercise, as people are intersectional subjects. And a feminist historical ontology, as I say here, enables site-specific investigations attentive to historical and political specificity of rights politics in most of the world, while refusing assumptions of universal translatability or of unidirectional translational practices. Importantly, it tracks the path of power that informs rights politics to shine a light on the intersecting axes of oppressions that characterize the attachment of rights politics to specific gendered subjects. It seeks to illuminate how what Hakka allows, articulates, renders intelligible, refuses, and to highlight how the gendered articulation of concepts and rights exceeds both the purpose and nature of their mobilization. In other words, a feminist historical ontology of Hakka is explicitly concerned with the processes and discourses of subjectivation and how gendered subjects of rights come into the vernacular. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have like nearly 40 minutes for questions and conversation. If you would like to speak, please put an X in the chat box and I will call on you. Alternatively, you can also type your question into the chat box and I'll read it out on your behalf. And if possible, of course, show yourself on camera and introduce yourself if at all possible. Thank you. Maya, is that a hands up?
It is, yes, thank you, yes.
I was looking for an X in the chat box, so sorry for the delay. Maya.
No worries. So, hello, Sumi. Lovely to see you. Welcome and huge congratulations on your book. And, it is truly scholarly and erudite. And yes, and you have followed the journey of Hakka through, both epistemologically, ethnographically, through your own spirit, etc. So it's wonderful to hear how that has been developed. My question really is whether I completely take your coming in and using and developing this idea and theory around Hakka to really question the global human rights discourse. I completely am with you on that journey. But my question to you is whether or not, if we see Hakka as a sense of entitlement, can we not directly kind of look at it in terms of frames of justice rather than frames of rights? And this is the question that emerges, when I'm thinking about, for instance, Amartya Sen's book on the idea of justice, where he talks really about how these vernacular, what we see as rights are actually ways of talking about justice, because it is about a sense of, a broader sense of morality that is not captured through that rights discourse. So my question to you is really, can we think about Hakka, in terms of sort of a practice of a certain kind of entitlement which speaks directly to justice? And as you know, in terms of the work that we've done together with women, domestic violence in Rajasthan, thinking about that women don't really talk about rights. They're just going straight to saying, where's the justice? And that's the way in which they claim rights. So it's really going towards thinking about notions of justice as a way of claiming rights. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but it's just a little point there. But thank you very much. I'm sure loads of people have questions to ask, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Would you like to reply right away?
Yeah, I could. We could collect it whichever way you want to do it. It's fine by me.
Maybe take them one at a time.
Okay, right. Hi, Maya. So lovely to see you. It's been a long time. Thanks so much. Yes, of course. And Maya, you were right there, right at the beginning, right when I was tracking the Hakka, particularly with the work on the Satins and so on. And of course, then it kind of broadened out into various other movements. I think, yes, absolutely. I entirely agree with you that I think that there is that justice is a really important way of moving into the rights discourse, in the sense that it's not coming from rights to justice, but it's actually coming from justice to rights. And in some ways, and that's why I wanted to use the work on truth that the Satins talk about, because that is explicitly a justice frame, and so on. But on the other hand, I also think that there is, so that, and what it might mean to think about the politics of the rights as a politics of justice, that's the kind of things that I'm thinking about at the moment. But I wonder if but there's also something to be said about that Hakka as a particular right, that especially that is seized and claimed for oneself. And I saw, and some of the ways that, and the kinds of contestations and conflicts that arise as a result of that particular relationship is also something that one needs to kind of think about. Because that is also, and that comes up when one starts noticing gender relations within collective mobilizations. As I was sort of saying, that women's rights is not something which comes up organically in any of these mobilizations. It always has to be backed separately. So there's something there which kind of gets in the way, as it were, of this sort of of justice being attached or being inclusive of all subjects, right? So there's clearly something in the way where justice is then attaches itself to normative subjects with those who are powerful and so on and so forth. And therefore that claim making, it is when the sort of, the very if you like, those who are non-normative, those without power, Dalit Adivasi women who then use the language of rights. And then when the kind of, pushback comes, and it comes really hard, that's when you realize there's something else going on. And there is the language of justice, but I think that it's the language, individual language, the language of hak as a right, when it is used as a right by these groups of people, and that's that easy translation between justice and rights doesn't quite take place. There's something else going on. And I think that is something we need to pay attention to, because, and so a couple of things in the book that I talk about are to do with the fact what happens when you raise the question, what happens to subjects who are unable to mobilize a critical mass in their favor, right? So as part of a collective mobilization, you're fine. But if you sort of say you want to stand for, say, a sarpanch, right, in a reserve seat for Adivasi women, and as an Adivasi woman, you sort of say, I want to stand as a sarpanch, and you make that claim and you make that demand, you very soon you realize that even though you might be leading a collective mobilization on forest rights, you will be left very much on your own straight away. And there is something that's going on there. And that is what I'm trying to kind of unravel and unpack, that there is that language of justice, but there is not an easy movement between the two. It's not an easy fluidity in quite the way that Sense talks about. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Louisa.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Sumi. So lovely to hear you. And thank you so much for writing this book, which I think will make all of our lives so much easier when we go about trying to teach a sort of human rights through a critical human rights kind of scholarship that has been sorely lacking. And I'm so delighted to be reading your book and to be reading it in conversation with people like Sipa Grovagui and his attempt maybe 10 years ago to offer alternative genealogies of human rights. He also references quite strongly and uses as his sort of thinking orienting device the Haitian Revolution, but also indigenous anthropologists like Shannon Speed, her very well placed Rights in Rebellion, that speaks of rights in their exercise. And yet I think your book does so much more, or is a progression of precisely this kind of thinking. And I think a lot of it has to do with this idea that you develop, that we need to study these concepts as they emerge in their sites, in their particular sites. And your attempt to do so through this assembling of feminist historical ontology, which I found extremely interesting, if not entirely unproblematic, of course, as you very well say yourself. But what struck me actually, Sumi, was that the turn to Hacking's attempt to understand sort of concepts and where they start and what they do and where do they go, could also be done through a much more specific site ontology. For example, I'm thinking here of the work of Theodore Shatsky and the attempt to think about particular sites of the social and not only the conceptual apparatuses of these sites, but also the material arrangements, right? Which I think possibly is an improvement upon Hacking's idea of sites. But so this is just an aside that was occurring to me as I was reading your book. But what struck me about the way that you mobilized it is that really it is the site, right, that is privileged. And your site, of course, is of particular interest to us, right? Of particular interest because it deals precisely, as you said, with non-elite sites of where critical vocabularies are emerging, but also a site that is about subaltern struggle. So it's already, as you say, conflictual. Yeah. So if we are to think about this, how do these sites, these subaltern struggles as particular sites of locating, thinking, reading hack, how do they help us with this idea that these concepts, these non-elite critical vocabularies, help these people make up themselves, right? But also make up people. So it is this particular area in your theorization that I hope you could say a bit more about, because it is extremely interesting to those of us interested in forms of political subjectivation, self-formation in rights struggles, and so on. So I wonder whether you could expand on that a tiny bit. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic to be reading your book.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Do you want me to respond, or do you want to go with some questions?
Up to you. I saw another X in the chat box, but we often take one at a time, particularly if they're extensive questions. So it's up to you.
This is a very extensive question.
You're right to decide.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, first of all, Lisa, thank you so much. I mean, that is, thank you for your question and all the comments about, about the other books. I mean, I know Shannon Speed's work, of course, Rights and Revolution, and Rights and Rebellion, and so on. I'm much less familiar with Sipa Grigorieva. I think I might need your to get some citations from you, or I'll just go on Google Scholar. So that's hugely helpful, and thank you so much. Yes, hacking, yeah, I mean, he's such a beautiful writer, though, isn't he? He writes, and I have to say that, it's that kind of, and I think that it's, oh yes, got it, excellent, yes, thank you so much for that, Melanie. I've been sort of thinking about, I suppose, about historical ontology for a while now, and trying, and as I was sort of saying, it is the work on concepts. It's the work on concepts as being a word in its sights that drew me first and foremost to him. But I was also quite struck by a couple of things. Really, what he does is that he, in the academy, becomes so used to. And of course, all your work on Foucault and counter-conduct and all of that, which has been so useful to me. I didn't get around to talking about how I use some of that work on counter-conduct to talk in terms of counter-development and how that produces very particular forms of, making up subjects, but also critiques of development are very much framed within that, right? So that produces counter-development and so on. So framing both the discourses, but also critiques of development within that frame, borrowing from Foucault, and also, like I said, the work on counter-conduct that you and your colleagues have been doing. So the site, yes, location is location. I see location as a generative site. So as a generative site for conceptual production, but also for making up people. And so that is why location is so important in terms of the production of concepts, but also the production of critical vocabularies and subjects. And so making up people then, the book really tracks political, so this making up of people occurs within political mobilizations. So I'm tracking live political struggles and the kinds of vocabularies that are used within these live political struggles and for claim making, and that is the word Huck. And then sort of looking at what does Huck make available in terms of what kinds of subjects and subjectivities that it will allow and which are the ones that it won't allow. And very often the people who've had to have, and that, as I was sort of saying earlier to Maya, that the conflicts that have ensued have very much been around the question of Dalit Adivasi women's rights. Right? These are the flashpoints whereby you see all this collective mobilization, the fracturing, the cracks coming through, these folks not being able to find that same critical mass around them for very particular kinds of struggles that they are also involved in. So that's the kind of but the making up of people, of course, is the claiming of rights for oneself, and to sort of then and the kind of self-fashioning that occurs, and I talk about that in quite a bit in relation to the Satins of Rajasthan, for example, but also other groups, whereby the self-fashioning, the kind of the sort of dissonance, the moral dissonance that occurs when you come across and you encounter this rights language, which you see in the first instance has actually been quite alien. No one ever told you, you've never seen a model, you've never seen anybody, you've never seen any other Dalit Adivasi woman actually having any kinds of rights. And then suddenly to be said, well, actually you do have rights. And then how do you relate to that sudden sort of way of or a possibility, and then of course realizing that in the experience, the actual experience of that is that it's an abstract idea, and if you try and actually put it in action, there's a lot of violence that ensues. So there is that, but still the interesting thing is, of course, that when I'm talking about the various justifications, I'm also looking at the ways in which those justifications then put in place very particular relationship, not only to the rights that are being claimed, but also relation to the self. And that is why I've been focusing on gendered articulations of Hakka, primarily because it is at those sites whereby you see when subaltern subjects, particularly Dalit and Adivasi women, make those claims, you see the normative subject of Hakka motives through denial and through the violence that occurs. And so straight away, that is why I was sort of saying Hakka is not a horizontal idea, but interestingly, it makes it possible for political subjectivation. And in some ways it's, yes, although I do critique him, but I think that in some ways, it's also a very Rancierian idea, in some, that it produces, that particular discourse produces forms of political subjectivation and a form of politics, and so on and so forth. And you can't sort of say in advance as to how those, what would emerge, because what one is dealing with most of the time is looking at the consequences of the repercussions after the articulation is made. Once that articulation of a rights claim is made by these subjects, then you see the pushback, but you also see the isolation. You see the sort of and that's is within political mobilizations happening. It's quite extraordinary. And Louisa, you said you read the book, and in some ways I'm thankful that you're reading it. So, but yeah, it's formation of subjects through particular languages, rights languages, is something that has kind of been driving the book, but it's also something quite hard to get at, and that for feminist historical ontology, because of the focus on the making up of subjects, but also the refusal to let go of, because of the imbrication of epistemology with epistemology with ontology. And you cannot, that there is that you can't speak in terms of ontological terms and so on and so forth, because that there is a very particular epistemology attached to certain kinds of ways of being in the world.
Well.
Does that make any sense, Louisa? It's a hard question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think it's really interesting. It's really interesting to try and refuse, I think, this idea of delinking, which has become so prominent. But because I think what you're very rightly pointing to is this idea that these are never pure or authentic, but are rather completely already overlaid with historical relations of power that are ongoing, continuing, evolving, etc. So I find that extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. No, yes, there is. I have a big problem with delinking, primarily because that assumes that is a possibility in the first place, and it isn't, for various reasons of violence, epistemic violence, but also, whole range of processes of colonialism, developmentalism, transnational capitalism, all kinds of things have made it impossible to even speak of things, but also because also because these languages of various entitlements don't come through this authentic prism at all. They come through a particular experience of dispossession, right? And so it is that, and I think it's very important to engage with those political struggles and not abstract ideas and philosophies from them without any, and then not relate them back. And I think that's the problem with some of that delinking stuff.
Val. Thank you so much, Melanie. Congratulations, Sumi, on your book, which I'm very excited to be reading. I'm so happy to see you in the flesh, if not meet you in the flesh. And of course, I'm very excited that you're joining our After Rights project and to hear you speak to rights and justice in a couple of weeks. I know, I'm the same. My question is actually quite strategic because I'm hoping it's going to help me with something I'm thinking through for my own paper. I'd like to ask you about something you mentioned towards the end, which was universal translatability. And I'm thinking of that in terms of, how these questions that you've posed, these big questions, how do we study vernacular rights cultures? How do we do this work on Hakka? And in your book, you make this very nice comparison between vernacularization on the one hand and thinking in terms of vernacular rights cultures on the other. And, you explain the difference between that beautifully. And essentially, as I understand it, this is about a focus on struggle. And I'm just wondering, for the translatability of struggle, so I'm understanding translatability as well as, working with Hakka at the same time as we've got this global human rights framework that we're dealing with. Is there a difference and a contradiction even between rights, even when framed in terms of or as Hakka, and obligation and obligations? And I'm coming to this through, some writing in critical legal studies that has been mainly around law in the Anthropocene and, our sort of obligations towards the environment as opposed to, a right to environment by, people like Scott Veatch, who's actually discussing on our panel, and Dan Matthews, Kathleen Birrell, and also work that I've come across using this vernacular vocabulary of fuzz. This is Mona Barn, who I came across very recently. He's done some brilliant work on this idea of fuzz. And I myself am trying to frame obligation towards kind of undesirable subjects that we've kind of outcast or we view as a stranger in terms of hukum, which is a notion I'm taking from radical Sikhi. So I guess I'm kind of coming round to this idea of obligation, as opposed to right in any form, as a way of doing relationality, claiming entitlement as a collective, and with this kind of cosmological awareness, which are all themes in your book. And so I guess the broad question is, does rights, even when framed as Hakka, need supplementing with some vocabulary or vernacular of obligation? Thanks.
Yeah. Wow. Another difficult question. I think we should reorganize our seminars in such a way that people then give questions and then I back the next day after having had a chance to think, because I think that it's so important to stay with some of these, with all the questions actually that everyone's asked today, and not be in this kind of place whereby, you know, you give this very quick, glib response. Yeah, so just one thing I wanted to ask about. I mean, by fars, did you mean obligation or duty? Because it could also translate as duty, couldn't it?
I did mean duty, yes. In that context, it is shaped as kind of cultural duty.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, right. Yeah, so I was just thinking that as you were saying, yeah. So about universal translatability, it's to do with, I think it's that kind of the impulse. So the epistemic impulse within global human rights scholarship, as I was saying, is that it has, you know, it has this impulse towards unidirectional translation. So kind of, you know, has a very fixed center from which they move, and then they get vernacularized, which is acted upon, right? And so it's that kind of movement with a very fixed center. There's an epistemic center for human rights scholarship, whereby, and then from there they will travel everywhere else where they will get localized, treated as case studies, you know, and vernacularized, and so on and so forth. And so it's that, to interrupt that impulse towards unidirectional translation, but also simplistic translation, that somehow there is a simplistic corresponding translation that we can just get involved and get into, and it'll be all translatable in this kind of way, right? In fact, when you are talking about obligation as duty or parts, you're actually bringing exactly that point out, which is that can that translation actually happen in quite that way? Because of course, farz, the Urdu word farz, within, you know, I mean, concepts, of course, sit within a body of other concepts, don't they? There is a particular relationality to the way in which conceptual architectures work. So, you know, and farz, you know, is within a very particular architecture of that. And I think the question of obligations, then whether one needs to think in terms of do rights need supplementing in terms of with something like obligation or duty? I wonder if that would take us back to that rights and duties debates, right? So in some ways there is also that, in which case, and of course within legal scholarship, that question of obligation is quite central. You know, when does a right become a right? When there's a duty bearer attached to it, right? And that's when is something, and all those conversations around when is a right, when is it a legal right, when is it a manifesto right, when is it a moral right, all that kind of, all those sorts of work around, you know, about what rights are and when do they become a right and not something else. That question of obligation, but what you're sort of saying is that, you know, if we move away from justice primarily in that legal form, and in that sort of justice is always sort of seen as through, say, trial courts or legal form, or that question of, you know, correlatives, right? So who's correlational to this and so on, and move in terms of sort of larger questions of obligations that we owe to people, even though we may not be in that direct correlative relation to them, right? That's what law, that's how, say, you know, a legal theory in many ways talks about, you know, obligation and so on. And I'm just thinking, well, that's already expansive. That's moving away from how one would think about obligation. Yes, exactly, Hofeld. So that's the name I was thinking about. Yes, so Hofeld and all his kind of criteria of when does a right become a right, and what do we owe, what are the kinds of frames of correlative, you know, sort of relations and so on and so forth, and who's the opposite, and what sort of, so all that jural correlatives. So once you move away from that, then you're asking, then you sort of get into the terrain of you might get into the terrain of moral obligation, right? And that itself then becomes quite fuzzy in some ways, and so on. And I can see why you would want to stay there and not go into rights, because if you move into the rights domain, then again, the same kinds of questions would be asked, whether it's, but obligation, I think, by at least first, could get you into thinking about more capacious and expansive ways of the kinds of what we might owe to those who are not like us, right? Or who are not part of the collective, or who are outside, or as you started by saying, undesirable. And so I think that actually is a much more expansive frame, but I think that you would have to sort of say, I'm leaving the domain of that, in which rights and obligation are thought of in terms of jural correlatives. I'm leaving that domain to think about obligation, in another domain, right? But I think what that domain is what you might have to come up with, I imagine. It's not very helpful, but I'm just kind of trying to think about the possibilities as you have been sort of laying them out. But I think it sounds exciting, very exciting. But I would love to know what that domain is, because I think, and I think that what would that mean in terms of a relationship to oneself? And I think that word hak, when Maya was talking about hak in terms of justice, what I found in terms of making a people, what Louisa was asking earlier about, was that when it's invoked as a right is when it's sort of that is a very particular relation to the self that's established. But I wonder how obligation would go about establishing that relationship with oneself. Will it be obligations towards others, but also obligation towards oneself?
We have a question in the chat box from, I believe it's Sangeeta. Sangeeta, I don't know if you asked that question as a hot pursuit in the middle of the discussion. I'm going to pull it up, but maybe if it's okay with you, would you be able to pose your question yourself? I can't hear you yet. Not yet. I could initially hear a noise, but not quite loud enough. Would you like to try again? Sangeeta, did you want to try again?
It could be your headphones.
If you unplug, it's not working. So we do have to meet again tomorrow then.
Oh, it's all right.
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Okay. Yeah. No, I was just wondering, thanks so much for such a fascinating discussion and a conversation. I was also wondering, I think in a very recursive manner, it's also a question of how one traces not only these relationships that these people have to themselves and to the others in a very relational sense, but also to the state. So not in the abstract sense, but then what does it tell us about in terms of how do we track that relationship to the state was what came to my mind. And I was wondering whether Sumi might have something to say on that.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Yes, it does actually. You're right. Yeah, and I think that's the and that's when rights and justice become quite entangled. Is precisely in making a demand on the state. It's a language of rights that's used but justified on the basis of various things. But it's also a very clear language of rights, primarily where the state is then designated as the duty bearer. In that case, that the state is then seen as a duty bearer who has an obligation to make these rights concrete or legal, and so on and so forth. And the thing about the relationship to the state, of course, is that as I was saying right at the beginning, that these these political movements are very much directing their claim making to the state. And that is why I can't see the delinking and so on happening, if you see what I mean, in that kind of decolonial sense, because actually they are very much directed at the state. And the interesting thing again here is gendered, because, you know, people will tell you, well, at least with the state, I can make those kinds of demands, actually try making those demands within the community, and you're not going to get anywhere, right? And so, and that, one of the things that came up, of course, was that in none of the, as I was saying, in none of the sort of rights mobilizations was the gender question, or women's rights in particular, actually, articulated organically as part of the movements, but also that in none of the justificatory premises were women's rights sort of articulated on any other justification other than constitutional legalism. That tells you something as well, that it's very much linked to, and this was very much was a very strong claim, the fact that, you know, that these women's rights come from the Constitution. That, you know, and so when it becomes very clear, so you again see that, and that is why I'm sort of saying I'm not quite there is that difficulty around justice and rights, primarily because when it comes to these moments, these kind of normative subjects, you're suddenly seeing Hakka, you know, going back, resting upon legal constitutionalism rather than cosmological rights, right? Rather than any others, but you are then sort of saying, well, women's rights come from the Constitution. And the thing with the state is, of course, is double-edged. Because on the one hand, there is the encounter with rights, particularly say for these women that I was talking about, the Satins that, that also Maya was referring to earlier, you know, they come in, their first encounter with rights is with, through the participation in a state-sponsored program, which that is how they come to know about women's rights in the first instance. And of course, when the state fails them, so often, particularly around sexual violence, particularly around, what might, questions of normative womanhood and so on and so forth. And when they encounter all of these crises, they turn away from the state, because the state no longer is an upholder of women's rights at all. Actually, that's just a big ruse. And then they turn to other justifications, including truth. So there is a very particular relationship to the state, which is one of deep of violence, but also, in the beginning, trust, and then complete disappointment, not just disappointment, but despair. Actually, the politics of despair comes through the politics of rights engaged in by the state, because the state is not committed. It has the state is rendered transparent. Its interests are rendered transparent as classist, casteist, masculinist, state. And so that's already, and those kinds of things come up when that relationship with the state is put under critical scrutiny, and then they turn away from the state, but not in a way to kind of go away, but in the sense that the state is still seen as somebody as having an obligation to uphold the rights, but the rights no longer come from the state.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Congratulations, Sumi, on such a fabulous book. Thank you to our audience for the very engaged questions and interventions. Certainly for us as a center dedicated to the foundations of knowledge in global politics, and specifically systematic reflections on the concepts that we use for theory building, you gave us a lot to think about and also to think with. And I'm very quickly going to turn over to Luisa for an announcement on the After Rights workshop that we now heard so much about. And I think we all want to know when it's happening so we can join. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. First of all, just say thank you again to Sumi. And if you've been enticed and you want to hear her again, you can do so on the 8th of December. From 1 p.m. to 5:30 in the afternoon. We have 2 panels on that particular After Rights workshop that day. The first one is on citizenship, abandonment, and the politics of justice, in which Sumi will be speaking. And the second one is on human rights, experimentalism, protest, and the city. Again, a very interesting set of discussions with colleagues such as Ilan Ruwal, Joe Hoover, who I think was in the audience, and Joel Bruce. So join us, please.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.